So here we are, the moment we've been building to this entire unit, World War One. So the goal today is for you to be able to explain how mania led to this world war. And yes, mania is an acronym that you should probably get familiar with. So the 1800s was a period of massive change for Europeans, right? It opens up with the Napoleonic Wars as Napoleon's armies are marching across and pretty much conquer almost the entire continent. This ends with the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where the European powers pushed Napoleon out, and they got together and said, how do we stop this from happening again? How do we stop another Napoleon from rising? And how do we stabilize Europe so we're not going to war with each other again? The Industrial Revolution transforms economies, but also warfare as new weapons are being produced. And the age of imperialism has expanded European powers and influence because of competition around the world. So now you have these highly industrialized countries that are pretty unstable with control over, well, most of the world. And we see this rise of nationalism, this intense feeling of pride in your own culture, saying that people who have my common language and history and heritage, we should all have a government and rule over ourselves. This increased national movement is conflicting with the idea that an emperor should rule over wide areas of territory with many nations inside that one government. So by the early 1900s, right, 100 years after the Congress of Vienna, these forces created a very unstable and heavily armed Europe. And that, of course, is a recipe for, well, nothing good happening. So again, not to be a broken record here, but after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, Europeans met at the Congress of Vienna with the goal of stopping another Napoleon Bonaparte from dominating European politics or the continent ever again. Right? They didn't want some charismatic person to come about and raise a bunch of trouble by getting people to pledge their loyalty to him and then waging war across the continent. They said that would be bad. We don't want that happening again. So what it is created a balance of power system where major powers would maintain stability by preventing any one nation from becoming too strong. That is, they kind of divided up Europe, reset the boundaries, and created these alliances to make sure that, essentially everyone was equally balanced in power, which means it wasn't worth risking going to war because you'll be fighting someone who is about your equal, and what's the fun in that? And surprisingly, the system actually worked for about 100 years, preventing major wars between these European powers, at least wars on the European continent. But new forces were beginning to weaken the system created at the Congress of Vienna. So this is where we're going to have several developments from throughout this semester kind of coming together into one big explosive moment, right? Industrialization, factories are producing weapons and strengthening economies, right? This is a picture of a weapons factory from this period. They are building massive, massive guns and a lot of them to be used on each other. Imperialism has the Europeans competing for colonies and resources around the world, so competitions in one area can easily spill over into war in another area. Nationalism is creating new national identities with pride, but also conflict with their rulers. And that alliance system created at the Congress of Vienna, well, it created military partnerships for protection. But those alliances meant that if two countries started fighting each other, a localized regional conflict can quickly spiral out of control. So, taken together, all these developments made Europe increasingly unstable, but also heavily armed. So Europe is a powder keg by the early 1900s, right? Essentially, this system created after Napoleon was under a lot of pressure. Industrial armies were growing larger, nationalist tensions were rising, empires were competing globally, and alliances meant conflicts could spread rapidly. One small spark could trigger a very large explosion, and all the leaders of European empires were playing with matches. And this is when the acronym MANIA comes into play. These are the causes of World War I, as historians like to summarize it. The first is militarism. European countries built very powerful industrial militaries that they liked to use and wanted to use. They even glorified war as something as the only way you become a man is by fighting in war. Alliances. Rival alliance systems meant wars spread quickly. Nationalism. Ethnic groups and nations demanding independence and influence over their laws. Imperialism, European powers competing for global empires. And the spark that set this powder keg off was the assassination, the killing of a political leader to trigger a crisis. Combined, these five forces create a very, very dangerous situation. I like to throw in an extra I sometimes for industrialization, but that's not part of the official acronym used by most historians. So let's dig into that first M, militarism and the industrial armies. The Industrial Revolution, which we studied earlier in this unit, drastically transformed how people fought wars. Factories could produce large quantities of weapons that could be used by anyone with very little training. Railroads allowed massive armies to move soldiers and equipment quickly so this war could spread. And Europeans built massive standing armies, and their leaders prepared detailed war plans about what would happen if this country invaded us or what would happen if we invaded that country, right? They had detailed plans on the shelf they could just pull and use. And many of these leaders believed that this war was inevitable. They said, well, it's been about 100 years since we fought a massive war. Might as well be time to try another one. But it wasn't just that the war was inevitable, they thought it would be a glorious thing and a way they could prove their manhood. But it also wasn't just Europe. America was also falling victim to these very same forces. This is kind of some things that draws us into this war eventually. With alliances, that balance of power idea created at the Congress of Vienna, it still influenced European politics, right? This idea that let's carve up Europe and let's create an alliance system so no one country can become too powerful. That'll prevent everyone from attacking each other, right? This idea of like mutual assured destruction was something that kind of held the peace for a while. But instead of stabilizing Europe, it eventually created an alliance of two separate rival blocs. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Austria-Hungary is a single place at this time. And the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. Now, I'm not going to be testing you on who is on whose side here, but it's generally a good idea to know who was fighting who. These alliances meant that a small conflict in one area between two countries would draw everyone else in. And since these other places had massive global empires, it was going to draw people from all over the world into Europe over this what should have been a very local issue. Nationalism, as I mentioned, is this idea that nations, people with a shared culture and history, should unify under a single government. And this helped create countries like Germany and Italy, but it also threatened large empires. So Germany, which really wasn't a thing until 1871, right? This area was the Holy Roman Empire, the Confederation of the Rhine, which I mentioned briefly once. They're more important than that, but we don't really get into it in this class. But Germany, all these Germanic-speaking peoples were kind of divided up into different governments for a very long time. But in 1871, they united into Germany under the leadership and the ruling of the Kaiser, king. 10 years before that, you get the unification of Italy, right, which used to be a bunch of different separate little kingdoms, but in 1861, this nationalist idea of Italy comes into existence, and it's all based on this idea that people with a shared culture, history, and language should have the same government ruling over them. But this is a problem for larger empires inside Europe. Austria-Hungary, the Habsburg Empire, right, is actually made up of all these different nationalities. And the Ottoman Empire, don't even get me started on them, because boy are they made up of different ethnic groups as well. And many of these groups wanted independence based on that idea of nationalism that unified Germany and Italy not too long before this. Especially troublesome was the Balkan region, this area right here. So here you see Italy, here's Anatolia, here's Greece, here's Albania. You can see here these colors are all the different ethnic groups in the Balkan Peninsula, which is this region right here, in 1914. So all these groups were like, we want a country of our own. And some of them were willing to kill to get it. Then let's get to the I, imperialism and global competition. During that scramble for Africa, Europeans competed for land and resources in order to fuel their factories, but it also increased rivalries between these major powers as these countries wanted those raw materials and they were in competition to get them for the industries. Again, those markets to sell to in that strategic territory. They're all fighting each other for these things. These rivalries are going to create additional tension between the European powers, as yes, they're competing in this area and they carved up Africa to stop a fight between them, but they still are jealous of each other. Again, I'm going to stick another I in here in industrial warfare. During imperial expansion in Africa, European armies used new industrial weapons, right? Better rifles, machine guns now became available. And technologies like the Maxim gun, the very first machine gun, allowed a small European army to defeat much larger armies. But World War I was different. Europeans expected a war in Europe would be just like the wars in Africa with the local populations there. The difference, though, was that the African cultures and civilizations and empires were not industrialized. In Europe, most of them were, which meant you had industrial powers now fighting other industrial powers with similar military technology, and they didn't really account for this. The result was a far more destructive war than humans had ever seen before. I mean, this was a level of chaos and destruction that literally broke people's brains, as PTSD wasn't something that people talked about before this. They called it shell shock at the end of the war, but we now recognize it as PTSD because the human brain really isn't wired for this level of brutality. Oh, with this powder keg of gunpowder just sitting around and European leaders playing with matches, that spark hit in 1914 in Sarajevo. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an heir to the Habsburg Empire, so a Habsburg himself, was assassinated by a Serbian who wanted Bosnia, which is where Sarajevo is, to become part of a new Serbian state based on Serbian nationalism. So essentially what happened to this guy, the Serbian nationalist, shoots Franz Ferdinand, a Habsburg, in the face because he wants Bosnia to be part of Serbia. And this is all also has to do with a wrong turn that the Franz Ferdinand's driver took. Ask me about that sometime, I'll tell you. So this Serbian nationalist opposes Austrian control in the Balkans, and they kill the heir to the Hungarian Empire, the Austrian Empire. So Austria-Hungary blames Serbia for the assassination, and they declare war on them. Right? The mighty Austrian-Hungarian or Habsburg Empire in the east declares war on tiny little Serbia over a nationalist issue. This should be a very localized affair. Massive Austria-Hungary Empire attacks Serbia. This will be over real quickly. At least that's what people thought. But Serbia's ally, Russia, says, hey, we're going to step in and attack Austria-Hungary because, well, we're allies with Serbia. Russia, though, has not really industrialized, really is taking their time to gear up. So they're kind of getting all their troops together, getting ready to attack Austria-Hungary as Austria-Hungary is fighting in Serbia. Well, Germany is an ally of the Austro-Hungarians, and so they declare war on Russia before Russia can attack the Austro-Hungarians. But Germany knows that, well, Russia is kind of slowly getting to get their things together. France is on their other side, is also very powerful, and is an ally with Russia. So Germany goes, well, if we declare war on Russia, we're going to have to declare war on France. And the quickest way to get to France was through the Kingdom of Belgium, so they invade through Belgium. And Belgium's ally was Great Britain, so now Great Britain is dragged into this war as well. So what starts out as a very regional conflict between the Austro-Hungarian Habsburgs and Serbians over an assassination from a Serbian nationalist spreads into this massive war across Europe, but because these powers are also global empires, they're also dragging in people from the rest of the world. How the United States gets involved in this is a longer story that we're really not going to get into. We're going to briefly reference it next class, but you'll get into that more in your U.S. history class next year. Now, European leaders were aching for this war because of militarism, right? They really thought this was going to be a glorious thing. They had plans drawn up. They thought it was going to be done really quick. They were telling their people, hey, we'll be home by Christmas. That's not what's going to happen. But they believe this because the recent conflicts they had across the world were very short because the European armies had superior technological warfare, right? They had superior weapons, giving them an advantage. World War I involves powerful industrial countries fighting each other, so the war soon turned into a very long and deadly stalemate, where neither side could really gain territory and they're just staring down and killing each other en masse. Most of this fighting happens on the Western Front in what's known as trench warfare. Essentially, these very long ditches. Some parts, they're very narrow and shallow. Other parts, they're more built up and more structured. But this is where soldiers would live in long networks of these trenches, and they would have machine guns on either side, barbed wire fences protecting them. And this is kind of where they spent most of their time if they weren't being ordered to climb up the ladders and bum rush the other side to try to get through those machine guns. Speaking of machine guns, both sides had them. They also had artillery, so shells they'd be launching with bombs that would kind of drop on you. And the idea was, well, we can win this war by just sending more people at the machine gun. After all, if we have more people than they have bullets, we can win this thing. But the problem is, they have industrial factories mass producing bullets, so they don't have more people than there are bullets, and they're just feeding people into these machines. And if you're wondering why these guys are wearing these bags on their faces, it's because those are gas masks, because it's around this time the Germans figure out how to use chemical warfare to create a gas that if you breathe it in, you will drown in your own lungs. So that was a real fun time, and since this gas was heavy, if you threw it into the trenches, it just stayed in the trenches. As you watched everyone else suffocate around you as you were suffocating. As you can imagine, these battles often resulted in enormous casualties with very little territory being gained. Essentially, you would send mass numbers of people to die in one of these battles, and then at the end of the battle, nothing changed. Both sides still had control of their own trenches. So millions died during this war. So you can call this the generation of the damned sometime. You can see here the countries, what percent of their population died in this war. So the Ottoman Empire, between 13 and 15% of their population. Other places like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, between 3 and 4% of their population. France loses between around 4% of their population. Russia around 2%. The United Kingdom, around 2% as well. This is a really large chunk of your population. And then look at just their armies, right? Look what happens to their armed forces, right? The Austro-Hungarians lose 90% of their mobilized soldiers in this war. Germany loses 65% of their soldiers. This is a massive loss, right? Russia loses 76%, France 73%, Romania 71%. These are mass casualties of their civilian population, but also their military populations. So there you have it. Here's mania. Again, you have the things that lead to World War I and its devastation: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, assassination, and again, I like to throw this extra I in there, industrialization. But that's because I keep thinking mania is spelled M-A-I-N-I-A, when it's really M-A-N-I-A. But regardless, all 6 of these things do lead to the start of World War I and makes it much, much more devastating than any war that came before. So next class, we're really going to dive in and look a little bit more at what life was like for these soldiers in these wars. But for now, this is a really long lesson. I do apologize for that, but I had to get through all this. I want you to write today's goal, those 3 facts, and the question for me to answer, and I'll see you next class.